allowing me to do that, and to the folks that are here that are joined so far, and to those who are hopefully about to join. Um, so good day to you all. It's pretty close to noon time, so the split between morning and afternoon. So I will just say good day and cover both. Um, as Beth said, I've got 40 plus years of experience, both working in industry and working with industry. Uh, Most proud about the fact of being able to add and retain jobs. That was always a key thing. I was always concerned, even when I worked in industry, that we weren't shipping stuff outside and losing jobs. And we were very successful at doing that. And that's always been a big thrust for me. In regards to Crayola, just very quickly, you had asked about the growth. When I joined Crayola, it was about a $75 million company. When I left there, it was about $650 to $700 million. And what we did to grow that was, and what I played a part in, we added a number of products. Crayola, of course, is well known as a crayon company. I'm sure you all have used it at one time in your lives. Maybe you still are, just won't admit it. But we added children's markers, which was a very small part of the business when I joined, and we almost got rid of it because it was so small and wasn't doing well. And I and a number of folks did a lot of things to fix the brand and the product, and it zoomed, and it became as large, if not larger, than the crayon side of the business, while we also continued to grow that. And then we got into other art materials and so forth, and just continued to grow and expand. One of the biggest jumps was when we became a washable art materials market, which was where kids could get messed up and you could wash it off rather than having ink stains and so forth. And that redefined the industry, because up to that point, washable meant that you could mark something and it stayed forever. So it was, wash proof, so to speak. Ours was to get it out and get it off of kids and their clothes and so forth. And when that happened, the business really zoomed, and we had a lot of work involved with that. And I was involved in all of that stuff from an operational standpoint. So that's a little bit about me. You didn't come to hear about me today. You came to hear about what's going on. Very timely topic with the pandemic going on. What I want to talk about are, first of all, what companies were doing, successful companies were doing before the pandemic, and what they continue to do during the pandemic, and kind of allude into what companies should be doing as this continues, because we don't know when it's going to end. We're hopeful that now with some breakthroughs with vaccines and therapeutics, that it'll be sooner than later, but we just don't know when that is, and we still have to deal with it and the aftermath. So what I want to talk about are 4 things that I saw successful companies doing before and doing now. And then to give you 2 examples of companies that I'm very familiar with, one that I was working with until just about a week ago when I ended my engagement, and one that Beth already mentioned, ESPI, and what was going on with them. And I was very much a part of that, even though I'm retired from there now. And then to conclude it all, tie us all together, and then to answer any questions that you may have. So, with that said, as I mentioned, there are 4 things that I see that successful companies were doing before, are doing now, and will continue to do in the future. I kind of rank ordered them by what I felt was important, but they're all important, quite honestly. But of course, when you got 4 things, you got to pick a top one, and so on and so forth. So my number 1 is and continues to be communication. And that's a lot of what I talk about, even when I'm consulting to clients or in the various things that I talk about. Just like in the book, the overarching thing in there is communication. Well, that's true with companies today. Successful companies have great communications internally and externally. Internally, they're keeping their people abreast of what's going on. And you can imagine with the turmoil that's going on right now in industry and business, and I'm sure you're experiencing that yourselves, you've got to keep your people abreast of what's happening. What does that mean for them? What are the things that they need to be doing now that are different than what they were doing before? Because change is certainly in the wind. And in these strange times, businesses are having to act and do things differently than they were before, and probably will be once we get back to whatever the new normal is. And externally, certainly they want to know what their clients or companies who depend on them or they depend on are doing, and what that, and then taking that information and fashioning it into whatever they're going to be doing in terms of responding to where the marketplace is today. Hopefully they were doing that, and again, successful companies do that on a regular basis, even when times are good, because the last thing you want is to go to either of those constituent groups only when you need something, because they will not respond as well to you as when you continue to communicate with them regardless of what the circumstances are. They will sniff out that you need something, and it may not be something that they need, and that you're only using it in order to enhance yourself. Really what you want to make sure is that they feel that you're concerned and caring about them regardless of what's going on, and that you've got their best interest at heart. The second thing is regular interaction with employees and clients. You might say, well, you already talked about that with great communication, but it's not just sending out a memo or making a telephone call. It's those face-to-face instances that you have with employees and clients, where it's a more personal type of thing, because we can communicate any which way, especially today. We've got texting and email and just like we're doing here with Zoom calls, but it's that personal touch that really that matters, and that's the regular interaction. And regular means it doesn't have to be every day, and it doesn't necessarily have to be every week, but it has to be something that you set up and you do it on a, if it is a weekly basis, it's a weekly basis. If it's every other week, if it's monthly, but it's regular, and it does happen so that people feel that you are keeping them in the loop. And the last thing is to include the employees in important discussions and decisions. We talk a lot about employee involvement and how companies run based on what their employees do. I've read a lot of stuff and written some things about leadership and how leaders, good leaders, great leaders, put the vision out there and then step out of the way and let people do what they need to do. But if you don't put that vision out there, and certainly if you don't tell people how the vision has changed, depending on what the circumstances are, in this case, COVID, how are you going to get them to act and react? So you need to include them. In some cases, they need to help to make the decisions about where the company is headed and how they're going to operate, what that's going to mean possibly in changes of work for them, and what they're doing and saying and who they're interacting with and how they're going to interact. So including the employees is certainly important. That's number one. A lot of stuff in there. Number two is planning. Very successful companies have plans. That starts with a 3 to 5 year strategic plan that's updated regularly, and regularly means probably after about 1.5 years, 2 years at the most, it needs to be updated because things have dramatically changed one way or the other. In this case, it certainly happened out of the clear blue at the beginning of this year. But good companies, successful companies have a strategic plan that they were working towards. They know what they're doing in terms of product and markets and facilities and equipment and so forth, and they're working to that. And they had those things in place before all of this happened. Now they'll change that, and we'll talk about that in a minute, but some companies who didn't suddenly got religion and realized they better have plans, because there's that old saying about if you don't know where you're going, any path will get you there. Well, that's certainly true with industry and with businesses. So having that 3 to 5 year plan is particularly important. And when I've been doing work with companies, one of the first questions when they hit me with, and it's usually a short-term tactical type of situation, is, well, how does this fit into your strategic plan? The good ones can tell me boom, 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 and the not so good ones will give me that blank deer in the headlight look, like, what are you talking about? What strategic plan? We don't have a strategic plan. In which case you go, well, maybe we need to drop back a little bit and talk about where you're headed and how this will fit. Because again, if you're trying to make changes and they don't fit where you're really headed as an organization, you could be doing seriously the wrong thing or things. Then with a strategic plan, you have an annual plan. So you take that first year chunk and you break it down into an annual plan that is certainly tied to the strategic plan, because if you've done a good job with the strategic plan, you've laid it out pretty much on a year-by-year basis, but you take that first chunk and you start to work it. So sometimes companies will have an annual plan. They will not have a strategic plan, but they do have an annual plan that they work with. Not the best situation, but better than having nothing. Okay, so at least we know what direction they were headed in. And then last but not least, they have a contingency plan, which is usually part of the strategic plan. And that says, if things aren't working out, how are we going to modify what we're doing in case of a problem or a potential catastrophic situation? Well, I can't think of something more catastrophic than what's happened this year with COVID, how that has impacted a variety of companies, a variety of industries. And the folks that had contingency plans in place, now they may not have had it to the degree of, that we were going to have a pandemic and shut down our economy for a couple of 3 months or whatever the case may be, and in some cases still be shut down to some degree. But they at least had an idea, if something catastrophic happened to them, how they could act or react. There's a lot of conversation, theory, and so forth about agility, and I was greatly involved with agility because I worked with the organization, which was Lehigh University, and a group of folks who had worked there, a couple of professors and just a non-professorial person who had identified agility back in the 1990s. And they didn't invent it. What they did is they studied successful companies and looked for the trends that they had developed and what they were doing that made them successful, and they identified 4 different areas. One of them was the ability to understand how their markets and their industries were changing and to adapt to them as quickly as they could. Because as we all certainly know, there is change at all times in industry and in life in general. And if you don't adapt as an organization to those changes, the need for products, what the products are going to do, how quickly you're going to get them out to people, or the services, if you're not a product organization, but a service organization or some mix thereof, but how you're going to adapt to those things and react to them. And that could influence your strategic plan. Something may come up out of the clear blue, like a catastrophic situation, and you've got to be able to adapt to that and to change how you're doing things and why you're doing things and who's going to be doing what in order to do that. So all that is part of the planning. It's not just having a plan, but it's then enacting that plan, doing something with it. There are some companies I know that put a plan together and then stick it on the shelf and it collects dust, okay? And then at some point they pull it out and they dust it off. Well, if they haven't been paying attention to it and doing what they said they were going to do, then it was pretty much worthless in the first place. So the good, successful companies have a plan and continue to plan. Next one is organizational structure. Successful organizations have a defined organizational structure. It's not a free-for-all. It's not everybody can do anything at any time, any way, and they're not sure who they report to and what their roles and responsibilities are supposed to be and who they're really working for, because 6 people are telling them to do something and they've got to pick for which of the 6 they're going to work with and satisfy, and the other 5 are going to kind of left out, or even worse, they try to satisfy all 6 and satisfy none. So there's a defined organizational structure, and we know who's reporting to who, and if it's a matrix organization where there's split leaders that you're following, that they're working together and they're in conjunction with each other, and that the individual is not confused by instructions that are different from one versus the other, that they tie together. And if there is a difference, it gets worked out. They also have policies, procedures, and formal job descriptions. They've tied down what they're doing, how they're doing it, who should be doing it, what you should be doing. And in those formal job descriptions, and this is my favorite, the last item is, or other things as specified by your manager. The one thing that I hate is when somebody says, well, that's not my job. If you are asked to do it in an organization, then it is your job. If your manager says, I need you to do whatever, you do whatever. And especially in these times when, again, the book was kind of thrown out and we're scratching for how we're supposed to operate, people need to do whatever they need to do in order to make the organization continue to be successful and to either survive or thrive in what's happening. And then the last thing is keeping track of everything and managing by the numbers. So it's important to pay attention to what's happening with the company. Are they still on track? Have sales dropped? Have people stopped ordering? Are new people asking for things? Or, you know, there's companies that are now dealing with items today that they weren't dealing with at the beginning of the year. How many companies are now making masks and all different types and shapes and other face coverings that they weren't before? And it's a big business. You're seeing it all over the place. I've been to shopping malls and different places, and that's prominent in a variety of different shops. I didn't see that 6 months ago. That was not out there. People, in fact, it's kind of funny that you go into a bank now with a mask and ask the teller to give you some money. Before, that used to be a crime. Now it's the way of operating. But you need to pay attention to what's going on and to manage by the numbers and make your decisions by the numbers. And then the fourth area is systems. A lot of companies that I've dealt with in the past have good systems. They keep them up to date. They utilize them, and they utilize them properly, and it makes their lives a lot easier. Some of the not so good ones do not have good working systems, either financial or non-financial, or a combination thereof. So financial is, it's fine that you can keep your accounting systems and so forth up to date and utilize your system for that. But what about customer service and customer relations? What about scheduling? What about manufacturing resource planning with how materials are purchased and when they come in and what the inventories are and so forth? Those things should be in place and should be helping you to run the business. And if not, It's very difficult when all of a sudden your business is thrown in turmoil and you've got to make decisions and you can't find out what it is you got, where you got it, how much you got, and all those good things. Also, you need to keep those systems up to date. Systems change on a fairly regular basis. A lot of the top systems that are used by companies are in release 10.2 or 11.1 or something like that. That means that they've had multiple releases and updates since they first came on the scene. And there are some companies I ran into that are still using the original version and wondering why it's not working so well and why they're not tied in particularly well with their industry or with their clients, because they didn't keep the systems up to date. And they didn't keep the data in the systems up to date, and that becomes a problem. The biggest problem with the system is not the system itself, it's what companies try to put into it and how they try to operate. That old saying about garbage in, garbage out, GIGO, is never more true, and I found that to be the case. When companies tell me that the system just isn't functioning the way they want, you find out, well, they put it up in 2 weeks and they're trying to run it and it ain't happening. It's because the stuff they put in was no good and it's got to get cleaned up. And when it is, all of a sudden everything starts to perk pretty well. And then again, it's using the information that's provided by the system in running the business. You got to pay attention to what it's telling you. Now, you don't just put it on autopilot and run. You have to look at what the system is telling you and then make decisions whether that's the way you want to go or not, okay? Because you may have some other information that wasn't programmed in, or again, that changed dramatically, and you've got to modify what your system is telling you, or you've got to put it in there in order for it to give you better information in regards to how you're going to operate the business. If you don't do that, and if you ignore it, and you're running off of spreadsheets and handwritten notes and so forth, then shame on you, because you're missing the whole idea for having information systems in the first place. So those are the 4 key things that I see. And of course, there are other things that happen with companies, and you may have opinions on that. But those are the 4 things that I see that successful companies were doing before all of this. And they continue to do it because they've got those things in place, or they're making modifications to them as they go along so that they fit the current situation. And they're also looking at, once we get out of this whole thing and get back to some sense of normalcy, that they can then either swing back to what they were doing before, or make whatever changes are necessary to their new normal, or whatever the case may be. But they've got building blocks in place. They've got foundations in place. Everybody okay so far? Any questions? Or are we good? Yes, good. I got a thumbs up. Terrific. Thanks, Glenn. Okay, so 2 examples. Number 1 is a company I mentioned that I was working with up until about a week ago. Actually, we had just about agreed on everything, and then the pandemic hit. So the work that I was intending to do was not pandemic related specifically, but it turned out to be, because before I ever got started, this hit. And I actually had to get a letter from them that, 1, said that they were an essential company, and 2, that I was an essential employee, even though I was a contract worker for them, and therefore could work. So in case I ever got stopped for where I was going and what I was trying to do, that I had this letter that I could hit. Company is Global ETS. They're located in Odessa, which is not too far from you folks. In fact, I believe they've joined BAMA now, Beth, if I'm not mistaken. Paula DeLuca, yes, got them to join.
Yes, they have.
So
this is Paula, Peter.
Which is great. They are a tremendous organization. They are located, as I said, in Odessa. They have a 10,000 square foot test facility with state-of-the-art equipment for doing testing of electronic components with, you name all the large companies, and they are probably dealing with them. So the Lockheed Martins, the Raytheons, the Boeings, just to name a few, Siemens, okay, a variety of different organizations. And they continue to grow and they continue to thrive. And how did they do that? Well, a couple of things. Well, actually, more than a couple, 4 things. During this pandemic, they have grown by at least 20%. I need to update that. I think it's more than 30% now. How did they do that? Well, they reached out to their current and new clients, all of who are also considered essential services. But again, you know, some of the difficulties that Boeing has had with some of their new jets and some of their old planes and so forth. So they've taken a hit and had to do some layoffs and so forth and cut some business back. But some of the others have grown their businesses, or, you know, just kind of put a hold on certain things, whatever. But they reached out to their current client base and said, what's going on? What does this mean for you? And what does this mean for us? In some cases, they lost a little bit of business. In some cases, they gained some business. In other cases, they stayed the same. But then they continued to reach out to potential new clients and got a host of new business that they didn't even have before this all started. You might say, well, everything kind of got waylaid. That's not true. There were businesses that were continuing to grow and were continuing to look for suppliers and folks that they could work with. And Global was there, and they sucked up some of that business. They had a plan going into this of 100% growth in 2 years. You want to talk about an ambitious plan. So they were not about to give that up, which is why, going back to the first part, it was important for them to get that continued growth if they're going to hit their 100% growth plan. And they did not modify that. They didn't say, well, we got to pull back. The owner said, we're going to hit it regardless of what's going on right now. So he has been extremely ambitious. And they told me that right now they've got about 300 new possibilities for clients, because they continue to work it, okay, and continue to push towards that 100% growth. What else do they do? Well, to meet these goals and to meet these objectives, and the reason why they brought me in was they felt that they were having some productivity issues. And you might say, well, what's a productivity issue with a testing service? Well, it's getting the number of tests done that you need to get done in the time that you need it to get done to satisfy your clients and to stay within the costs and so forth. And the owner didn't feel that that was happening, and that they needed to make improvements in order to grow the business the way he wanted to. And he didn't want to do it just by adding more heads. He wanted to make sure that his people were the most productive that they could be before he added heads. He wasn't adverse to doing it, but he said that's the easy way to do it, is to just throw more bodies at it. But that wasn't the way he wanted to go. So what we did is we worked on those things that I had mentioned in the organizational part, all those pieces about job descriptions and processes and policies and so forth, to make sure that those were all up to date. And some of them needed to be updated because they had changed and they hadn't been quite updated the way they should have. But also to develop training plans. They didn't have a formalized training plan in place in each of the different areas. So as they were bringing the new people in, even though they would have experience in the industry, you know, with any new company that you join, no matter how much you know, things are not the same as what you know, and you have to get ready for that and deal with it. We put those things in place. So they had formalized training plans to get people up and running as quickly as possible, because you know that a new person, a trainee, is not going to be certainly as efficient or effective as somebody who's worked for 2, 3, 4, 5 years, or certainly 15 years, because they just don't have that kind of knowledge. So the quicker that we could get that to them, and the more that they could see, the better off they would be. So we worked a lot on training plans, okay? And also they had to, because they're, even 10,000 square feet is not a large facility for an organization, their people work fairly close to each other. So they had to develop safe working conditions for all the employees. They had to put that spread between them, that social distancing, as we call it. In this case, work distancing, because it's not a social deal, it's a work deal. They went to masks. Everybody wears masks throughout the organization, and they're not allowed to skip that. So I was masked when I went in there, and I worked with the folks. But they have grown, is the key thing. They have not just survived, they have grown. And what did they do? Well, they communicated to their people, first of all, what their goals and objectives were and how those weren't going to change, but how they were going to meet them. Okay, they had the organizational structures in place, and they developed them even further and made them stronger than they were before. So they gave their people more tools to use. We also developed checklists. They didn't use checklists before, so there were errors that were being made as they were trying to get things out quickly. They now have, each person has a checklist. So each job that that person does, he or she has to go down that checklist and check off each step that they supposedly did and sign off on it. So if there are any problems, the manager or their quality people or the owner can go back to them and say, hey, Joe or John or Jim or Sarah, you signed off, and yet there's a problem here. Are you doing what you should be doing? Don't take this as just something that perfunctory that you do and it doesn't have meaning. It has meaning, because it's not good enough to get the job done quickly. The job has to be done correctly. That's what we're building our reputation on. That's why we're growing. That's why companies want to do business with us. And if we don't provide that, it doesn't matter if we did it fast and we did it cheaper than everybody else. If it's not right, that's not good. So checklists became a big thing also. So they had the structure, they have the systems, and they continue to keep them up to date. So they are the latest versions that they use, and they use about 3 different systems, and it costs them a lot of money to do it. But they maintain those, they maintain their equipment, and they buy the newest and the latest and the greatest. The owner is not afraid to put back into the business, and he certainly does that. They also had a bonus program at one point, which they stopped, but they are in the process of putting that back into place to reward people for the growth of the company and to kind of do a profit sharing with them. And they are including their people in the decisions that are being made and how to work within the conditions that are prevalent today that they're dealing with. So that's global. The second one is my old company, ESPI. And here's what comes right off of their website. And it talks a little bit about it. As Beth had mentioned, they are a preeminent consulting firm located in the eastern part of Pennsylvania, dealing mostly with Northeast Pennsylvania firms that would go up, if you're familiar with Pennsylvania, up into Scranton, Wilkes-Barre, out towards University Park, and out into the Berks County areas, down towards Philadelphia. So a large swath. There's a tremendous amount of industry and business in that area, but also dealing nationally and internationally with firms. We had and continue to deal with firms such as Samsung, and East Penn Manufacturing, which is known as Deca Batteries, Hershey, Air Products and Chemicals, Crayola Company. As it was stated in my bio, we had 300 plus companies in the 17 years that I worked there, and they've added since then. So they're probably up to about 350 different companies, and 70 to 75% of those companies are repeat business. That's a big indication for a company, is when clients continue to come back and to give you new and more business than what you did before, not the same old stuff that you were working on. So they're a consulting organization. And that has a challenge to it too, because guess what? One of the first things are that companies will cut back on when they're having issues. It's outside services, and that's a consultant. So in the first 2 weeks, they got hit big time. Almost every one of their client companies in March decided to postpone or suspend project business. So what, now we had the benefit of having gone through this once before. If you all remember back to 2008 and 2009, it wasn't COVID time, but we had that financial situation with the loans and the banks, and businesses were not spending money and cutting back, and we had a mess. Well, we had to deal with that back then, and we survived through that. I wouldn't say we thrived, but we survived, okay, because we just couldn't convince them to do work. So we had that experience, and we took that as a learning, and they put that into place as a condition in case it happened again. Again, not knowing that it was going to be a pandemic, but just in case there was a big shock to industry. So what were the things that ESBI did? Well, they immediately looked at their expenses and looked at how they could reduce them, and they reduced them in quite a large fashion without getting rid of people. We never got rid of anybody in 2008, 2009. They didn't get rid of people this year either. What they did was they reached out to the current clients to convince them that they shouldn't shut everything down, because it would not be in their best long-term interests to do that, but rather that if they continued to do some of the work, the important work, and to really ferret out what that was, that they could continue to make progress towards what they had wanted to achieve and why they started projects in the first place. So that when everything, again, the dust settled and everything cleared, that they wouldn't have lost time and effort and so forth. Because there's a thing about inertia. When you stop working on something and you let it go for a period of time and you pick it back up again to get started and to say, well, where did I leave off? What did I, what was I doing at the time? What do I need to get started on? Inertia is tough. So you don't want to ever stop unless you absolutely 100% have to for whatever reason, because getting started again is tough and it costs money to do that. They applied for and they got PPE. So they reached out to the government and they were okayed, and they got money that helped to tide over some of the loss that they had. It didn't cover everything, but it certainly helped in the mix. And they got a host of new clients. They didn't just sit back and say, oh, woe is us, what are we going to do? They got aggressive. They went out and they got a bunch of new customers. Now, typically when I was there, we had between 20 and 30 active clients. We were just talking about a month ago, and they have 20 to 30 active clients that they're working with. So they have been able to maintain and to some degree grow since that time, because they've added new people that they didn't have before. They've got some people that they're working with that are giving them some of the work that they intended, They got some that are still sitting on the sidelines a little bit, waiting until, again, the dust settles before they decide. But they kept the stable pretty well occupied and operating. And it was a lot of work, obviously, but it's what it takes. Again, if we go back through the 4 things that we were talking about, they communicated both internally with their people and told them what the situation was. They didn't hold anything back. They communicated with myself because I'm getting equity payments from them. So I was part of that reduced expenses because for 3 months I agreed not to take an equity payment, which they owed me, in order to do my part, along with a couple of other people who had retired, until things stabilized and they could get themselves back on track and working again. So there was a lot of communication. We had lots of meetings on it. And in fact, they were able to restart the payments more quickly than what we had originally agreed upon. They had planning because, again, they had dealt with this before. We had dealt with this before in 2008, 2009. So there were plans in place in case something extraordinary happened again, and they were able to act and react to what was going on then once it occurred. They certainly have the organizational structure in place. They always had that, continue to have that, and they had the systems. They are able to track everything, to deal by the numbers, and to I wouldn't say turn on a dime, but at least a quarter. They can turn on a quarter, which they were able to do. They were able to go through their databases and search out the new clients and hit up the different organizations that they had in order to find out who might need some help, particularly with them managing the pandemic and what they were going to do. So they turned some of their business model to how are you going to deal during the pandemic, and what can we do to help you to work through this? How can we help to reduce some of your expenses and look for new opportunities and so forth? So they came out of it fine. They were concerned when it first started because whoop, you get hit and all of a sudden everybody's calling you and saying, oh, we're going to stop our project. Oh, we're going to hold off. And of course you go, whoa, what's going on here? But once you get through that initial blow, then everything was fine. It took them a couple of days to sort it all out, and we had some discussions, and they did a fine job. So those are 2 examples of companies that did the 4 successful things and continue to do 4 successful things. They communicate well internally and externally, and they include their people in what they're doing. They had plans in place and they adjusted those plans, and they had contingencies just in case something happened, that they could move towards what that contingency would be and how to deal with it. They had the organizational structures in place. People knew what to do. If there were new things that they needed to do, it was communicated to them, and they did what was necessary, and they had the systems in place to give them the information that was necessary, and they dealt with that stuff. So there are the 4 important things. There are the things that these companies did, and through that, they have been able to not just, in my opinion, survive, but they continue to thrive, and they're positioned well for once everything comes back, that they can handle whatever it is that the future holds for them. So with that, I've concluded what I wanted to say for today. Hopefully that helps you as organizations, and you have some ideas, if you haven't already put them in place, as to things that you need to be looking at that can help you moving forward. We're not out of the woods yet. We've got increasing cases of COVID, to some degree not as serious as before because we're managing the hospitalizations and the deaths, but they're still occurring. Caseloads are going up. It is impacting businesses here, there, and everywhere. But these are things that you should be looking at, if you haven't done them already, that you should be certainly considering doing, that will help you as they help the 2 companies that that I put in front of you. So if you would like to discuss any of these things more, here's my contact information. Feel free to write it down. And Beth has a copy of this presentation if you want it. I believe if you ask her, she would be happy to share that with you. Correct, Beth?
Absolutely.
And if she doesn't, for some reason, if she gets obstinate about it, just ask me. I'll be happy to, but I'm sure she'll give it to you. Here are also my contact links. You can get me on LinkedIn if you haven't already, if we're not connected. And here is my website that covers not only my book, but I also do consulting and speaking. So you can contact me there and say, hey, I'd like to discuss what we were talking or what you were talking about, you know, and what that might mean for me, or if you've got a question that you would like to pose, you can certainly do that. So lots of places that you can get in touch with me, or you can get back through Beth or Paula DeLuca, and they have my contact information. They'll be happy to hook us up. So with that said, are there any questions that I can answer now for anybody based on what I discussed?
We did have a question come in.
Okay.
And with regard to your 4 key attributes for the companies you've studied, what was the typical revenue size or EBITDA size of the companies where you saw these attributes in some form of positive use?
Right. The companies that I talked about in general, not the 2 specific, they ranged anywhere from about $5 million to multiple billions of dollars. As you can imagine, Samsung is a multi-billion dollar organization. So it really varied. I would say that most of them were in the 25 to $100 million range as far as overall revenues, and their EBPI, I'm going to say in the 10 to 15% range. The 2 that I showed you, Global is a private company. I'm not sure how well they want to share their information, you know, as far as actual revenues, because they are privately held. So I'm not sure I can share that with you, but they are in the millions of dollars. Okay, ESPI is about a $4 or $5 million consulting organization. So a variety of different sizes that I've dealt with and do deal with. Okay.
All right, are there any other questions?
Anything else I can answer for anybody?
Peter, for a typical strategic plan, what
Yes.
components would you recommend to have included in a strategic plan?
Well, it starts, of course, with what you see your sales and revenues being from where you start now to where you're going to be, and you take that out over the course of, again, it's a 3 to 5 year period. I tend to like 5 years. A lot of companies say that's really stretching it too far. You shouldn't go more than 3, because the crystal ball is pretty hazy at 3 years, which is true. But the companies I always worked for, we had a 5-year plan. So you start with what are your sales and your revenues going to look like on a year-by-year basis, and you break that down even more finely, because you're not just dealing probably with one product or service, but with multiples. So you want to break that down into whether you've got divisions or product lines or whatever the case may be. Once you've got those things in place and you've decided what it is you're going to do and how you're going to go about it with sales, then what supports all that? If you're a manufacturer, what are you going to need in order to support that kind of sales and that kind of sales growth? And also, if there's profitability issues, Crayola, oh my God, companies would kill to be as profitable as Crayola was. Our average gross profit margin on a product was 70%. and I'm not making that up, and you didn't hear that wrong, 70% gross profit margin. And the after-tax profit was on the average 25 to 30%. Not everybody obviously is in that case, but we were always looking at that and trying to maintain that or to grow that. So there's a cost reduction in there, or putting in more profitable, hard to imagine more profitable products, but that type of thing. So how are you going to support that? What programs are you going to put in place in regards to cost reductions? And again, that wasn't headcount reductions. Ours was purely on how we could take costs out. If there were any headcount reductions, they were deferred. And they were deferred in the case that as people either left the company by choice because they took a job somewhere else or they retired or whatever the case may be, then that position wouldn't have to be refilled. So there was always a constant battle with finance over, well, did you really save money because you didn't let anybody go? But we would show over time that money would come in and it would happen within a year or two. But what kind of facilities are you going to need? What kind of equipment? Is it going to be new equipment? Because some of the items that you're going to be making are not the same as what you're making today. So you're going to have to add new stuff. What are you going to need in terms of capacity? What are you going to need in terms of replacement? Those types of things. And they all have to tie together, because I've worked with some companies that said put a strategic plan together. First thing we did is to go out and to survey everybody and say, well, what is it you're working on? And we literally found that each group was working on their own set of things and nothing was cohesive. It didn't tie together. So one hand didn't know what the other hand was doing, literally. So people were working on, in some cases, items that were in conflict with each other. And when they came to a head, they were going to go, wait a minute, we can't do that because I'm doing, and it was just a mess. So we got everybody together, and there were literally 250 different objectives that the companies, that was happening within the company. And we said, you can't have that. That's too much. It's crazy. So we boiled it all down and got people talking to each other. So it's got to be a flow. It's got to start with where are we headed, and then what are all the things that need to be put in place that are going to support this. And then what I would do when I was at Crayola and I was in charge of project engineering is I would put that annual plan together, and it was pretty easy because it said, we need to buy this piece of equipment, or, we're going to do this for safety and environmental reasons, or this is to support new products. And it was already laid out because we could refer right back to the strategic plan year one and say, here's what we said we were going to do. Well, here's the plan to do it now. Okay. So, but it takes some time to do it. It usually took us a good 6 to 9 months to put a strategic plan together if you're going to do it thoroughly and correctly.
Okay, great to know.
Okay. Anything else I can answer for anybody? Again, if not, and you think about it later, you can certainly get in touch with me at any one of these places, and I'll be happy to chat with you.
Okay, well, I'd like to thank everyone for attending today, and I'd like to invite you to our virtual roundtable, which is next Tuesday, November 17th at 11. It's a conversation with Norman Bodek, making lean more effective and inspiring people to be more motivated and excited to work. He's been called the godfather of lean, so it'll be a very interesting and informative presentation again, just like today was. So we do invite you to join us for that next week, and you can sign up on the BAMA website. Hopefully we'll see some of you tomorrow at our annual golf fundraiser for STEM education. But I would like to thank Peter Christian for taking the time out today to present this to our group. Again, if you have any questions for Peter, please reach out to him directly, or you can reach out to me as well, and I can get the information to him. But thank you again all for joining us, and have a great afternoon.
Great. Thanks again, Beth.
Thank
you.
you
All. Have a great day.